The first clue was nothing more than a flash of her phone screen in the dead of night. It was late, and I'd come home early from a business trip. When I walked into our darkened bedroom, Rachel was lying there, her face illuminated by her phone. She didn't hear me come in, and I was about to say something until I saw the name on the screen. It was my best friend, Tom. She glanced up, her eyes widening for a split second before she forced a casual smile. "Oh, Jack," she said, sliding the phone under her pillow. "You startled me." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach, but I kept my tone light. Talking to Tom so late? Didn't realize he was so interesting these days. She shrugged, dismissing it with a wave of her hand. "Oh, he just called to ask about the company dinner this Friday. You know how he is, always fussing over details." But something was off. Rachel's laugh was too quick, her voice too sweet, and her fingers were still clenched tightly around her phone. I didn't ask more questions. Instead, I walked into the bathroom, shut the door, and let the unease sink in, feeling the pulse of something dark forming. Tom and I had been friends for years. He'd been the best man at our wedding, had spent countless evenings at our dinner table. And yet here was my wife, whispering to him in the middle of the night, eyes darting like she was afraid of being caught. As I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, I could feel the urge to confront her boiling under the surface. But instead, a different plan began forming in my mind. Rachel and Tom weren't just going to get an angry confrontation. If they were betraying me, they were going to regret it deeply. The next morning, I watched Rachel as she went about her morning routine, studying every detail, every word, every glance she gave her phone. She moved around me like I was invisible. And in that moment, I knew that she thought she could get away with it. I spent days pretending everything was normal, waiting for my moment for proof. And it didn't take long. When she stepped out of the room one night, her phone screen lit up on the kitchen counter with a single message. "Miss you. Can't wait for Friday." The sender? Tom Reynolds. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. No, I felt calm, calculating. If this was the game she wanted to play, I'd give her the performance of a lifetime. The days that followed felt surreal. Rachel's behavior was a maddening blend of tension and normalcy. Like she'd slip into an affectionate gesture one moment, then stiffen as if she'd remembered something terrible. And me? I kept my reactions neutral, playing the part of the oblivious husband. I smiled, nodded at her stories, laughed when I was supposed to, even if the sound felt hollow. Behind it all, I was watching her carefully. Every text, every glance, every late-night message was ammunition. But I knew that I needed more than just suspicion. No, if I was going to do this right, I needed a plan that would make Rachel and Tom regret every minute of their betrayal. I took my first steps in the early hours of a Monday morning, hours before dawn. Rachel was asleep, her phone under her pillow as usual. I carefully lifted it from her grip, the screen lighting up as I navigated to her text messages. There, in blunt black and white, was the thread of messages that had confirmed it all. "Miss you. Can't wait to see you on Friday. Maybe we should tell him?" "No, not yet. Soon." It was all I needed to know that their affair was real. But instead of confronting her right then and there, I placed the phone back and slipped out of bed. My mind buzzed with a plan that was still taking shape, the thrill of it growing with every minute. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted a reckoning. I spent the next few days analyzing everything about Rachel and Tom's schedules. Rachel had a standing girls' night with friends on Friday evenings, so she told me. Now I knew she'd been spending those Fridays with Tom. He'd meet her somewhere, usually a rented room at the edge of town, a hotel where no one knew them. And I knew exactly where that room was. Friday arrived, and with it, the chance I'd been waiting for. Rachel left that evening with her usual, "Don't wait up for me." I played along, pretended to be interested in the weekend football game, and a six-pack of beer. As soon as she left, I grabbed the small suitcase I'd packed in the closet, one that held everything I needed to start my plan. I arrived at the hotel a few minutes after she'd gone up, staying out of sight in the lobby until I was sure they'd settled in. Then, slipping on a pair of gloves, I walked toward the hallway, my heart racing. The small bag I carried held a container of blood I'd picked up at a nearby butcher shop, a few bullet casings I'd carefully handled to avoid fingerprints, and a set of disposable clothes I'd found at a thrift store. It was a bizarre combination, but then again, this was no ordinary plan. I placed the blood carefully around the floor outside their room door. Just a few drops here and there. Not enough to raise suspicion with the staff, but just enough to make an impact on police if, or rather, when they came around. The bullets I slipped under the door, making sure they'd be visible to anyone peering inside. The goal was to make it look like something violent had happened, something they would both struggle to explain away. With the staging complete, I returned home, putting everything exactly as I'd left it. I even had time to turn on the football game before Rachel walked in, as casual as ever. "How was girls' night?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Oh, you know," she replied, not meeting my eyes as she hung her coat. "Same old." I felt a surge of anger, but I held it back, knowing I couldn't let anything slip. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled on the couch beside me, the perfect picture of a loving wife. She had no idea that her world was about to come crashing down. The next day, I made the call. I used a payphone from a few blocks away, disguising my voice as best I could. "Hello, I'd like to report something suspicious at the Riverside Motel, room 214, I said. There might have been a struggle. I hung up before they could ask any questions, heart pounding with anticipation. Hours later, I watched from our living room as police cars pulled up to Tom's house. I heard Rachel gasp as she looked out the window, her expression frozen in shock as officers escorted Tom out of his front door, handcuffed and bewildered. He tried to say something to Rachel as he passed, but the officers held him back, leading him to the car. "What's going on?" she whispered, looking at me as if I had the answer. I just shrugged, feigning innocence. "What's happening, Rachel?" I asked, my voice calm. "Didn't you say you had no idea where Tom was?" She faltered, her gaze darting between me and the squad cars outside. I don't know. He must be in trouble," she stammered, her face pale. I watched her, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. In that moment, I felt the satisfaction I'd been waiting for, the realization sinking in for her that something had gone horribly, horribly wrong. And she had no idea just how deep the hole went. The police were knocking at our door moments later, asking if she would accompany them to the station to answer a few questions. I stood back, acting the part of the concerned husband. Rachel looked at me, panic flashing in her eyes as if begging for some explanation, some excuse. But all I gave her was a small, unreadable smile. "Good luck," I said softly as she walked out, giving her a short wave. Watching her leave with the police was just the beginning. Now I had set the scene, and soon everyone would see what kind of betrayal this really was. And the best part? Rachel and Tom didn't know the half of what I had planned for them. It was strangely satisfying to watch everything fall into place. The day after the police took Rachel in for questioning, I made sure to stay home, waiting for the inevitable chaos to begin. It didn't take long. By mid-morning, a detective called me, asking if I could come down to the station. "It's just routine," he assured me. "We'd like to go over some things concerning your wife's statements." I agreed immediately, doing my best to sound like a confused but cooperative husband. As I hung up, I took a moment to review my plan, step by step. I couldn't afford a single misstep now. When I arrived at the station, I was led into a small, bare room. Detective Rawlings, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression, sat across from me. He offered a brief nod, gesturing for me to take a seat. "Mr. Thompson," he began, "I understand that you may not be aware of the specifics, but your wife has been brought in for questioning regarding an incident involving a friend of yours, Tom Reynolds. Do you know anything about his relationship with your wife?" I kept my expression neutral, meeting his eyes. "No, detective. Tom and I are close friends, but Rachel and I, well, we don't share everything about our friends' lives. Is something wrong?" He leaned forward, scrutinizing me. "I won't beat around the bush, Mr. Thompson. There's evidence to suggest that your wife and Mr. Reynolds were involved in an affair. We have reason to believe that their relationship might be connected to some suspicious activity involving a possible crime." I feigned shock, lowering my gaze as if processing the information. "Rachel? An affair?" I had no idea," I whispered, letting my voice shake just enough to sound convincing. "I never thought she'd. Well, I don't know what to say." Rawlings seemed satisfied with my reaction, and he continued, detailing evidence they'd found at the motel. They confirmed the blood samples I'd left were a match for mine, and the bullet casings had been found, indicating a possible struggle. In addition, they discovered text messages between Rachel and Tom that heavily implied a meeting. "Mr. Thompson," Rawlings said finally, "we believe that either Rachel or Tom, or both, could be responsible for what we're calling a potential attempted murder." The detective's words hit me like a rush of cold air, even though I'd staged every inch of it myself. I'd imagined the scene in my head so many times, but hearing it from an actual investigator somehow made it real. Here I was listening to them describe a crime I created, and they were buying it. All of it. I let my shoulders sag, as if under the weight of it all, before asking in a choked voice, What do you need from me?" He gave me a sympathetic look. "Right now, nothing more than your cooperation. Your wife and Mr. Reynolds will be held as we continue our investigation. I know this must be difficult, but we'll keep you updated as we find out more." I nodded numbly, letting myself be ushered out of the station. Outside, I allowed myself a moment to savor the weight of what I'd done. I'd meticulously framed the two people who had betrayed me, and now the police were closing in around them. Back at home, I knew Rachel would call sooner or later. I waited, watching my phone like a predator waiting for its prey, knowing she'd reach out to me for comfort or support. And sure enough, hours later, my phone lit up with a call from her. I picked up, keeping my tone cold. "Jack," she began, her voice unsteady. "They're saying I'm a suspect. They're saying I had something to do with an attack on you and Tom. It's insane. I don't know where this is coming from." "Where it's coming from?" I replied, my voice as flat as I could manage. "Rachel, do you really think I haven't noticed? Do you think I haven't seen the looks, the late nights, the messages?" She was silent for a moment, then stammered, "Jack, it's not what you think. I was going to tell you." "Tell me what?" I demanded, letting the anger finally seep through. "That you've been sneaking around behind my back with my best friend? That you've been lying to my face for months?" "Jack, please let me explain. It was a mistake. A stupid mistake," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "A mistake?" I said, almost laughing. "Rachel, I don't know if this is something you can explain your way out of." She tried to respond, but I hung up, knowing she'd feel the icy finality of it. Let her sit with her guilt. Let her wrestle with the realization that everything was falling apart, and that I had no intention of helping her piece it back together. The following days were a whirlwind of news reports and neighborhood gossip. I watched as Rachel's reputation crumbled, as her desperation became palpable. She left me countless voicemails pleading for a chance to talk, to fix things. She tried every tactic she could think of, apologies, tears, even anger, but I never responded. It was her turn to feel the loneliness and confusion she'd left me to deal with. One evening, I received a call from Rawlings. "Mr. Thompson, I just wanted to inform you that based on the evidence, the district attorney is moving forward with a case against Rachel and Tom. The charges will likely include conspiracy and attempted murder." I listened, letting the detective go on, and then thanked him. As I hung up, I couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. My plan had worked beyond my expectations. Not only had Rachel and Tom's betrayal come to light, but they were about to face the full weight of the justice system. But I wasn't done yet. My goal had never been to just get them arrested. I wanted to make sure their lives were as ruined as mine had been, and then some. And now that I'd set things in motion, I had more work to do. The days that followed were a storm of media headlines, police interviews, and a relentless flood of news about the attempted murder of Jack Thompson. I watched it all unfold from my quiet vantage point, while Rachel and Tom struggled under the weight of the accusations I'd carefully placed on their shoulders. I didn't leave the house much. I didn't need to. With every new update, it was clear my plan was advancing just as I'd envisioned. One morning, about a week after their arrests, Detective Rawlings called me again. I could hear the strain in his voice as he asked if I'd come in to answer more questions about Rachel and Tom. He didn't give specifics, just said that the investigation had taken some unexpected turns. But I could tell from his tone that he was frustrated, maybe even desperate. This was exactly what I'd counted on. The more they dug, the deeper they would be pulled into the snare I'd set up. At the police station, Rawlings gestured for me to take a seat, his eyes studying me closely. "Mr. Thompson," he started, "we've got new developments in this case, and I want you to hear them directly from me." I leaned forward, keeping my face as neutral as possible. "Of course, Detective. I'll help however I can." He hesitated, glancing at the thick folder on his desk. "You're aware that your wife and Mr. Reynolds are still being held. But there's more to this situation than we initially thought." I nodded, waiting for him to continue, but internally, I felt a rush of satisfaction. Rawlings was clearly grasping at straws. He didn't know what to believe, and I was going to make sure he ended up believing exactly what I wanted. "Since your last visit, we've gathered additional evidence," he said, flipping through the folder. "We found blood traces outside the room they rented at the motel, and the casings you mentioned, of course. But we've also uncovered text messages and calls between Rachel and Mr. Reynolds, indicating plans to meet in private on multiple occasions." My jaw tightened, and I forced myself to look pained. "So, it's true then?" "They were really." I let my voice break a bit, hoping to paint myself as a man struggling to come to terms with his wife's infidelity. Rawlings nodded sympathetically. "I know this must be hard to hear, Mr. Thompson, but yes. It appears that your wife and Mr. Reynolds were involved in a relationship behind your back. They met frequently, often late at night, and sometimes at the same motel." I forced myself to take a deep breath, feigning distress as Rawlings continued to walk me through each sordid detail they'd found. The police had pieced together just enough to believe that Rachel and Tom's relationship was the motive behind what they suspected was an attempt on my life. And since there was no clear evidence that I was dead, the case had become more complex. They'd labeled it an attempted murder and conspiracy for the time being, but with every new discovery, it was clear that the police were inching closer to pushing for a harsher charge. Before I left, Detective Rawlings looked at me with a sort of fatherly concern. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "I can only imagine how difficult this has been for you, finding out about your wife and your best friend like this. But we'll get to the bottom of this. Trust me on that." I nodded, forcing a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Detective. I just hope justice is served." I walked out of the station, adrenaline pumping. Things were progressing even faster than I'd anticipated. It was one thing to plan a scheme like this, but to see it unfold with such perfect precision, that was a thrill I hadn't anticipated. But it wasn't just about watching them get dragged through the mud. It was about making sure they stayed there, ruined and broken, with no hope of escaping the trap they'd walked into. I spent the next few days quietly gathering any additional evidence I could create to strengthen the case, feeding little details to the detectives when they called to check in. I was careful not to overdo it, making sure every new piece of information sounded just plausible enough to keep their suspicions alive. Then came the day I'd been waiting for, Rachel and Tom's formal arraignment. The courthouse was buzzing with reporters and cameras, all eager for a glimpse of the woman accused of conspiring with her lover to murder her husband. I stood at a distance, watching as Rachel and Tom were led out of the police van, shackled, their heads bowed in shame. The once confident, smiling faces of my wife and my best friend were now etched with terror and humiliation. As they entered the courtroom, I took a seat in the back, far enough not to be noticed but close enough to catch every word. The prosecution laid out the case. The blood, the bullet casings, the hidden relationship. Rachel's lawyer did his best to argue her innocence, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no body, and that my sudden disappearance could just as easily be voluntary. But the judge seemed unmoved, and after reviewing the evidence, he denied both Rachel and Tom bail. The look on Rachel's face as the bail denial hit her was priceless. She looked like she'd been punched in the gut, like the reality of her situation had finally sunk in. Tom looked no better, his usually calm expression shattered by the panic of a man realizing he might never see the outside of a jail cell again. It was a moment of pure satisfaction. I'd orchestrated every step of this, and now they were trapped, helpless in the jaws of the system, with no one to blame but themselves. After the arraignment, I went home and poured myself a drink. I raised the glass to my reflection, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. I'd waited so long for this, dreamed of it, planned every detail. But it wasn't over yet. There was still the trial, the final act in this play of betrayal and vengeance, where I'd watch them both fall completely apart. And then, just as I was settling into the idea of their inevitable conviction, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I frowned, unlocking it to see a single line of text. "Meet me. There are things you need to know." A friend. A chill ran down my spine. Who was this? How could anyone know what I was doing? Was someone onto me? I typed back, my fingers cold against the screen. "Who is this?" There was no response. I waited, my mind racing through every possible person who could know something about the plan. Had I been too careless? Or was this just some kind of fluke? That night, sleep was hard to come by. The message had rattled me, casting a shadow of doubt over what I'd thought was a flawless plan. But by morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just a prank, maybe someone with the wrong number. But the next day, there was another message. This time, it was a photo of Rachel and Tom, taken from outside the courthouse with a note underneath. "They'll find out, Jack. You're not as clever as you think." My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. Whoever was behind this, they didn't have enough to derail my plan. Not yet, anyway, and I'd make sure it stayed that way. I deleted the messages, blocking the number, and went about my day as usual. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I'd underestimated someone. And if there was even a chance they could ruin everything I'd built, I'd have to find them before they found me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. If someone thought they could interfere, they were about to find out exactly who they were dealing with. The messages kept coming over the next few days. They'd pop up on my phone at odd hours, a photograph, a sentence or two, a hint that someone knew what I'd done. Whoever it was, they seemed to enjoy taunting me, feeding my paranoia with little reminders that I wasn't as invisible as I thought. The first few times, I'd tried blocking the number, only for the messages to come through from another. They were just clever enough to avoid leaving any clear clues, but vague enough to be maddening. And each one seemed to know exactly how to get under my skin. The night before the trial, I received a video. The clip was short, just a few seconds long, but it was unmistakable. It showed me in the hallway outside the motel room, where I'd set up the fake crime scene. I was in profile, looking down the hallway, my face briefly lit by a hallway light. It felt like the ground dropped out from under me. I replayed the clip over and over, looking for any detail, any hint of who could have captured it. But it was too dark, too grainy to pinpoint where it had been filmed from. That night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, replaying every step I'd taken, trying to figure out how I'd missed this. Whoever had taken that video had been there watching me. They knew what I'd done, or at least some part of it, and now they were using it against me. But I couldn't let myself panic. Not yet. I needed to keep my head clear to see this through to the end. After all, Rachel and Tom's trial was set to begin in the morning. With any luck, the prosecutor's case would be strong enough to get the conviction I wanted, and once they were found guilty, there'd be no going back. The next morning, the courthouse was packed. The press had latched onto the story of a woman accused of conspiring with her lover to kill her husband, and the public couldn't get enough. Cameras flashed as Rachel and Tom were led inside, shackled and pale, their expressions hollow. I could see Rachel's eyes searching the crowd, and for a brief moment, they landed on me. Her face twisted in a way I'd never seen, a mixture of shame and desperation. But I kept my gaze cold and unreadable. Inside, I took a seat near the back, far enough to observe but close enough to feel the tension radiating from the defense table. Tom was slouched in his chair, avoiding eye contact with everyone, while Rachel sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though she was holding herself together by sheer will. The prosecutor began his opening statement, painting a picture of betrayal, conspiracy, and greed. He described the evidence in detail, the blood, the casings, the text messages between Rachel and Tom, which had been damning enough to suggest they'd planned to get rid of me and run off together. He showed the jury a series of messages I'd carefully planted, crafting a digital trail that led straight to them. The prosecutor's tone was steady, confident, and I could see the jurors nodding, glancing between Rachel and Tom with expressions of disgust. It was working. My plan was working. Then it was the defense's turn. Rachel's lawyer was young, probably fresh out of law school, and looked nervous as he approached the jury. He started with the usual, attempting to create doubt, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial, that there was no clear motive for Rachel and Tom to harm me. But it was a weak argument, and he knew it. The evidence I'd staged was strong enough to counter any doubts he tried to plant. For the next few days, I watched as witness after witness took the stand. Neighbors who'd seen Rachel and Tom together, hotel staff who'd confirmed their frequent visits, text messages pulled from their phones that painted a vivid picture of an affair built on secrecy and lies. I'd known the affair was real, but hearing the details out loud, reliving every sordid detail, made it even more satisfying to know they'd face consequences. As the prosecution wrapped up its case, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. They'd presented everything flawlessly. Rachel and Tom were painted as scheming lovers willing to do whatever it took to rid themselves of an inconvenient husband. The jury was watching them with disdain, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they'd render a guilty verdict. But just as the defense was preparing to rest, something unexpected happened. Rachel's lawyer called an investigator to the stand, a private investigator, he said, who'd been hired by a concerned party to look into my disappearance. My stomach twisted as a tall, wiry man took the stand. He introduced himself as Paul Maddox, a former detective turned investigator, and as he settled into his seat, his eyes scanned the courtroom, landing briefly on me. There was something in his gaze, something sharp and knowing, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Mr. Maddox," Rachel's lawyer began, "can you tell us about your findings in this case?" Maddox nodded, his voice calm and steady. "I was hired by an anonymous client to investigate the circumstances of Mr. Thompson's alleged disappearance. Over the course of my investigation, I discovered a number of inconsistencies in the evidence presented." He turned to face the jury, his expression serious. For one, the blood samples found at the motel showed a strange inconsistency in their degradation. Based on lab analysis, it appears they may have been collected from an animal source rather than human. The courtroom fell silent as Maddox continued, describing how he'd traced the blood back to a local butcher, one known for supplying unusual requests. I gripped the edge of my seat, forcing myself to stay calm as he went on. This man was dangerously close to unraveling everything. He must have been the one sending me those messages, the one who'd taken the video. But how had he known? How had he been able to trace it back to me? But Maddox wasn't done. He went on to describe other inconsistencies, the placement of the bullet casings, the lack of fingerprints, and a missing timestamp on the security footage from the motel, all suggesting that the crime scene might have been staged. His words washed over the courtroom, filling the space with a tension so thick it was nearly unbearable. The prosecutor objected, arguing that Maddox's testimony was speculative, but the judge allowed it, urging the jury to consider it with caution. And as Maddox stepped down from the stand, he glanced my way again, his expression almost smug, as if he knew exactly what he'd done. He'd planted seeds of doubt in the jury's minds, and I could see them whispering, their expressions shifting. When the defense rested, the judge dismissed the court for the day, and I left the building in a daze, my mind racing. Maddox had thrown a wrench into my plan, and I had no idea how much damage he'd done. If the jury began to doubt the case against Rachel and Tom, everything I'd built could come crashing down. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Maddox's face, that look of smug satisfaction. He'd been watching me the whole time, lurking in the background, waiting for his moment to strike. And I'd walked right into it. The next day, the jury went into deliberation. Hours passed, then a full day, and by the end of it, I was ready to claw my way out of my own skin. I couldn't bear the thought of them being acquitted, of Maddox's testimony undoing everything I'd worked for. But I'd come too far to let it all unravel now. So I sat there in the courthouse, waiting, barely breathing, as the jury finally returned to deliver their verdict. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, my heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the stakes of everything I'd risked to get here. I told myself I was prepared for any outcome, that I'd planned for every possibility, but the events of the last few days had shaken me. Maddox's testimony had threatened to pull apart the careful threads of my plan, and now the verdict was all that stood between me and the satisfaction of watching Rachel and Tom go down for good. The judge addressed the jury, and the foreman stood, holding a small piece of paper. I watched his expression, looking for any clue, but his face was as neutral as a stone. The entire courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle, the weight of 1,000 eyes on you and no room to breathe. We, the jury, find the defendant, Rachel Davis. He paused, glancing down at the paper, guilty of conspiracy and attempted murder. A wave of relief washed over me, so intense I almost gasped. I forced myself to remain calm, though my heart raced with a dark thrill. They bought it. Despite Maddox's attempts to undermine the case, the jury had seen Rachel as the betrayer she was. The foreman continued, and the defendant, Tom Reynolds, guilty on the same charges. It was like music to my ears. The verdict had landed exactly as I'd hoped, and as the sentences were read out, 15 years for both of them, my satisfaction turned to something almost euphoric. The look on Rachel's face was everything I'd imagined and more. She sat there, her mouth open, her face drained of color, a silent plea for mercy or understanding that went unanswered. Tom's shoulders slumped, his face a mask of disbelief and despair. As the judge dismissed the court, I could feel Maddox's gaze on me. I turned just slightly, catching a glimpse of his sharp, calculating eyes, and in that moment, I knew he wasn't done. The jury might have ruled in my favor, but Maddox had something else in mind, and he wasn't going to let go until he had me. He knew there was more to the story, more that he could use against me. And if he had his way, he'd expose it all. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing as they peppered me with questions. I put on a carefully crafted look of quiet sadness, giving brief, pained answers, playing the role of the betrayed husband. I let them capture my grief as I described how devastated I was by the betrayal, how I'd never suspected Rachel and Tom could do something like this. It was almost laughable, watching them hang on every word, nodding sympathetically. But as I walked to my car, that feeling of triumph began to slip, replaced by a growing unease. Maddox was still out there, watching me, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he'd make another move. I couldn't let him jeopardize everything I'd worked for, not when I was so close to freedom, to finally leaving this entire twisted mess behind. That evening, I sat at home, nursing a drink, replaying the events of the day in my mind. The trial was over, the sentences had been passed down, and Rachel and Tom were being transferred to separate facilities within the week. Yet Maddox's shadow loomed over it all, a reminder that my victory wasn't as complete as I'd hoped. The next day, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address, just my name scrawled in a hurried script. My pulse quickened as I tore it open, revealing a single sheet of paper with a photograph attached. The photo was a high-resolution still from the video Maddox had sent earlier, the one of me outside the motel. Beneath it, a note was written in bold, sharp letters. "I know what you did, Jack. I know it all. Meet me at the old bridge tonight. Midnight. Alone." I clenched the paper in my hand, feeling a surge of rage. Maddox was taunting me, pushing me to the edge, daring me to face him head-on. He was forcing my hand, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. If I didn't go, there was no telling what he'd do, how far he'd go to expose me. But if I met him, maybe I could silence him for good. That night, I arrived at the bridge just before midnight, the air cold and damp around me. The bridge was a secluded spot, abandoned for years, with rusted beams and creaking planks. I parked a short distance away, walking cautiously into the shadows, every sense on high alert. Maddox was already there, standing at the center of the bridge, his hands in his pockets. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "So, you came," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. I stopped a few feet away, keeping my face neutral. What do you want, Maddox? He tilted his head, studying me with a look that was almost amused. I want you to admit it, Jack. Admit what you did. All of it. I clenched my fists, refusing to give him the satisfaction. You have no proof, I said evenly. Nothing that could hold up in court. Maddox smirked, shaking his head. Maybe not, but I don't need proof to make your life very difficult, Jack. I've got enough to keep the heat on you, to keep investigators asking questions. He took a step closer, his gaze darkening. And if you think I'm bluffing, you're underestimating me. A surge of fury shot through me. This man had the nerve to stand here, taunting me, after everything I'd accomplished. I'd built the perfect plan, crafted every detail to ensure Rachel and Tom paid for their betrayal. And now this nobody wanted to tear it down? What's your price, Maddox? I asked, my voice cold. How much to make this go away? He chuckled, shaking his head. I'm not here for money, Jack. I'm here for justice. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. You don't know anything about justice. You're just a washed-up investigator, clinging to whatever scraps of power you can find. But this is beyond you, Maddox. Walk away. For a moment, he said nothing, just watched me with that infuriating smirk. But then he reached into his jacket, pulling out an envelope and handing it to me. These are copies of everything I've collected. Evidence, photos, the video. You name it. He crossed his arms, his expression hardening. Destroy that if you want. But I got backups. You go free, but you'll always know I've got enough to bury you if I decide to use it. The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't bluffing, and I knew it. Maddox had me in a corner, and there was nothing I could do to stop him without risking everything. I took the envelope, my mind racing with possibilities, my grip tightening around the paper. I wanted to lash out, to silence him, but I knew that would only dig me deeper. Maddox had played me, and I had no choice but to retreat. As I turned to leave, he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. Sleep well, Jack, knowing I'll always be watching. The walk back to my car was a blur, rage boiling in my veins. I'd come so close, only to be stopped by a man who'd somehow managed to outsmart me at the last second. Maddox had ensured that my victory would never be complete, that I'd always live under the shadow of his threat. I drove home in silence, the weight of Maddox's words pressing down on me, the knowledge that I'd never truly be free of him. As I pulled into my driveway, the reality of my situation hit me with full force. Rachel and Tom were behind bars, and the world believed they'd conspired to kill me, but now my own life was locked in Maddox's grip. I'd thought I was in control, that I'd orchestrated the perfect revenge. But in the end, it was Maddox who held the power, and I was left with nothing but the bitter taste of a hollow victory. Weeks passed, but Maddox's threat lingered in the back of my mind, an ever-present shadow I couldn't shake. Life was supposed to feel triumphant. Rachel and Tom were serving their time, their reputations destroyed, their lives shattered. But instead of satisfaction, I felt trapped, knowing that at any moment, Maddox could destroy everything I'd built. I went through my days as though everything was normal, returning to work, picking up old routines, trying to settle back into a life that felt like it should be mine again. But each time I looked over my shoulder, there was a paranoia I couldn't escape. Maddox's threats echoed in my mind. I'll always be watching. And it was true. Somehow, I always felt his eyes, somewhere beyond my line of sight, just waiting. The turning point came when I received another message from Maddox. I hadn't heard from him in weeks, but now his words were plain and clear. You have a choice, Jack. Confess, and I disappear. Remain silent, and I'll make sure the world knows everything. I stared at the message for a long time. Confession would mean losing everything, watching my own life burn to the ground, but there was a certain logic to it that even I couldn't ignore. The weight of carrying the secret had become a prison of its own, and Maddox had ensured that I'd never truly be free. Maybe, in the end, the only way out was to let it all fall. The next morning, I walked into the police station, my steps steady. I asked to see Detective Rawlings, who appeared minutes later with a mix of surprise and confusion on his face. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I'm here to confess, I said, my voice calm, the weight of my decision settling over me. Rawlings led me into a small interrogation room, where I told him everything. The affair, the staged crime scene, the setup, every calculated move I'd made to orchestrate Rachel and Tom's downfall. He listened in silence, and by the end, his expression had shifted from disbelief to anger. It was a look I knew I deserved. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," I said quietly. "I just wanted it to be over." The formalities followed quickly, the confession written, signed, and logged. And as I walked out of that room, I felt a strange lightness, a freedom that had eluded me for months. By the end of the week, the news would spread, and the truth would eclipse the lies. Maddox would no longer have a hold over me, and I would face whatever came next on my own terms. That evening, as I sat alone in my now empty house, I realized the full extent of what I'd done. The revenge, the lies, the manipulation. I thought I could control everything, but I'd only woven a trap for myself. I'd let my need for revenge blind me, and in the end, I'd lost the only thing I truly wanted: peace. A few days later, a final message arrived from Maddox. It was short, no gloating, no smugness, just a simple sentence. "You did the right thing, Jack. Maybe someday you'll understand why." As I read those words, I realized he was right. I had done the right thing. Not for Rachel, not for Tom, not even for the system. I'd done it because I needed to be free, even if that freedom came with a price I hadn't anticipated. Now, with everything laid bare, I'd face whatever judgment awaited me, knowing that I was finally free from the tangled web I'd created. In the end, maybe that was the only justice I truly deserved.